He was a man who left behind no diaries, no letters to his children, no personal memoirs, no revealing confessions about his inner life. He was a man who wrote some of the most intimate, profound, and psychologically penetrating works in the history of human literature. But he revealed almost nothing about himself. He was a man who was born in a small market town in the English countryside, a man who was the son of a glovemaker, a man who had only a grammar school education, a man who never attended a university, a man who was married to an older woman, a man who spent most of his adult life in London as an actor and a playwright, a man who was not a member of the aristocracy, a man who was not a scholar, a man who was by all accounts a fairly ordinary man. And yet this same man, this ordinary man from Stratford-upon-Avon, would become the greatest writer in the history of the English language, a man whose works would be translated into every language on earth, a man whose plays would be performed more often than any other playwright in history, a man whose characters would become archetypes of the human condition, a man whose words would shape the very way we think, feel, and speak. This is the story of William Shakespeare, a man who is perhaps the most famous and the most mysterious figure in all of literature. But here's what most people do not realize about William Shakespeare. The man who is remembered as the greatest genius of the English language, the man who gave us Hamlet, Macbeth, and King Lear, was also a man who was deeply immersed in the grubby commercial world of the Elizabethan theater, a man who was a businessman, a shareholder, and a hustler, a man who was not a solitary genius writing in a garret, but a working playwright who was constantly revising, collaborating, and adapting his work to the demands of a fickle audience. He was a man who was a product of his time, a man who was shaped by the political and religious turmoil of his age, a man who was deeply concerned with the nature of power, the fragility of human existence, and the depths of the human soul. He was a man who was not just a writer, but a visionary, a man who understood the human condition better than anyone who has ever lived. To understand William Shakespeare, you have to go back to the beginning, to the bustling, crowded streets of Stratford-upon-Avon, a small market town in the heart of England, where he was born in April 1564, during a time of immense religious and political upheaval. England was a nation that was being torn apart by the struggle between Catholics and Protestants, a struggle that would lead to persecution, exile, and execution. His father, John Shakespeare, was a glovemaker and a wool dealer, a man of modest means but considerable ambition, a man who would eventually become a bailiff, the highest office in the town. His mother, Mary Arden, was the daughter of a wealthy farmer, a woman who came from a family of substantial means. William was the third of 8 children, a boy who was born into a family that was struggling to maintain its position in the world. He was educated at the local grammar school, a school that was dedicated to the study of Latin and the classics. He learned to read and to write, and he was exposed to the great works of Roman literature, the plays of Plautus and Terence, the poetry of Ovid and Virgil. It was a rigorous education, a foundation that would provide him with the tools he would need to become a great writer. But his formal education ended when he was around 13 years old, when his father's fortunes began to decline. He was forced to leave school, and he was apprenticed to a local tradesman. He was a young man who was learning the realities of the world, a young man who was being prepared for a life of work, a young man who was not destined for a life of privilege. Not much is known about his life between the time he left school and his arrival in London. There are many legends and many rumors, but there is very little concrete evidence. He is said to have been a school teacher, a soldier, a law clerk, a country schoolmaster. He is also said to have been a poacher, a man who was caught stealing deer from the estate of a local nobleman. The truth is lost to history. He was a man who lived in obscurity, a man who was not destined for greatness. In 1582, when he was just 18 years old, he married Anne Hathaway, a woman who was 8 years older than him. The marriage was a hurried affair, and it was followed by the birth of their first child, Susanna, just 6 months later. They would later have twins, Hamnet and Judith, in 1585. It was a young family that was struggling to make ends meet. He was a man who was supporting a wife and 3 children, a man who was trying to find his place in the world. He was also a man who was deeply restless, a man who was searching for a purpose. a man who was not content to spend his life in a small market town. He left Stratford for London sometime around 1587, a time when the theater was beginning to flourish. He was a man who was seeking his fortune, a man who was determined to make his mark on the world. He joined a theater company, and he began his career as an actor and a playwright. He was a man who was working in a world that was both exciting and dangerous. The theater was a popular form of entertainment, but it was also a world that was seen as disreputable, a world that was often associated with crime, prostitution, and disease. The theaters were closed during outbreaks of the plague, and the actors were often at risk of being arrested. It was a world that was precarious, a world that was always on the edge of collapse, but it was also a world that was full of creativity, a world that was at the center of the cultural life of the city. He began to write plays, and he began to achieve a measure of success. He was a man who was learning the craft, a man who was learning to please an audience, a man who was learning to adapt to the demands of the stage. He was a man who was beginning to make a name for himself. The period between 1590 and 1613 was the most productive period of his career. He wrote approximately 38 plays, 154 sonnets, and 2 long narrative poems. He was a man who was writing at an astonishing rate, a man who was constantly creating new works, a man who was constantly experimenting with new forms and new ideas. He was a man who was deeply immersed in the intellectual and cultural life of his time. He was influenced by the works of his contemporaries, by the great writers of the past, and by the events of his own time. He wrote comedies, histories, tragedies, and romances. He wrote about love, war, ambition, jealousy, revenge, and redemption. He wrote about the nature of power, the fragility of human existence, and the depths of the human soul. He created some of the most memorable characters in literature: Hamlet, Othello, Lear, Macbeth, Romeo, Juliet, Falstaff, and Rosalind. He was a man who was exploring the full range of human experience. His plays were performed at the Globe Theatre, a magnificent wooden structure that was built on the banks of the Thames. He was a shareholder in the theater, and he became a wealthy man. He was a man who had achieved success, a man who had achieved fame, a man who had achieved wealth. He was a man who was respected by his peers, a man who was admired by his audience, a man who was the preeminent playwright of his age. His personal life was marked by both joy and tragedy. His son, Hamnet, died in 1596 at the age of 11. It was a devastating blow, a loss that would shape his work for the rest of his life. The grief of the loss of a child is a recurring theme in his later plays, a theme that is explored with extraordinary depth and sensitivity. He was a man who was deeply affected by the death of his son, a man who was forced to confront the fragility of human existence. He continued to write, to perform, and to build his career. He continued to be a presence in the life of his family, and he continued to be a successful businessman. He purchased a large house in Stratford New Place, the second largest house in the town. He was a man who was building a legacy, a man who was preparing for his retirement. In 1613, he returned to Stratford and he retired from the theater. He was a man who had achieved everything he had set out to achieve, a man who was ready to enjoy the fruits of his labor. He died on April 23, 1616, at the age of 52. He was buried in the chancel of Holy Trinity Church in Stratford, and his grave is a place of pilgrimage for his admirers. The epitaph on his grave is a warning to anyone who might disturb his remains. Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. He was a man who was buried in his hometown, a man who was remembered by his family and his friends, a man who was celebrated by his contemporaries, but he was also a man who would be forgotten, a man whose fame would fade, a man whose works would be neglected for generations. But his works were not forgotten. They were rediscovered, and they were celebrated. They were translated into every language on earth. They were performed on every continent. They were read by billions of people. They became a part of the fabric of our culture. They shaped the way we think, feel, and speak. They have inspired countless writers, artists, and thinkers. He was a man who had achieved immortality, a man whose name would be synonymous with genius, a man whose works would be studied and performed for centuries. The legacy of William Shakespeare is one of the most profound in human history. He is remembered as the greatest writer in the English language, a man whose works have shaped the course of literature and culture. He has been honored with statues, memorials, and monuments around the world. He is a man who is considered one of the most influential figures in history. But his legacy is also a story of mystery and intrigue. The authorship of his plays has been questioned for centuries, with some scholars arguing that they were written by a more educated, more aristocratic man, a man who had access to the court, a man who was a scholar, a man who was a member of the aristocracy. The debate about the authorship of Shakespeare's plays is a fascinating and enduring mystery, a mystery that adds to the allure of his work. Why should someone born today still care about William Shakespeare? Because his life is a testament to the power of the human imagination and the importance of the creative spirit. He was a man who was born into a world of poverty and obscurity, a man who had only a grammar school education, a man who worked as an actor and a playwright in a world that was often seen as disreputable. He was a man who was not a scholar, a man who was not a member of the aristocracy, a man who was not a part of the establishment. He was a man who lived a relatively ordinary life, but he was also a man who had a vision, a man who was able to see the world with a depth and a clarity that was unmatched. He was a man who was able to capture the essence of the human experience, the joys and the sorrows, the triumphs and the defeats, the loves and the losses. He was a man who was able to create characters that are universal, characters that speak to the human condition in a way that is timeless. He was a man who was able to use language in a way that was both powerful and beautiful, a way that could capture the deepest emotions and the most profound thoughts. He was a man who was able to create works of art that are as relevant today as they were 400 years ago. He showed us that the most important thing is not the power we wield, but the creativity we express. He showed us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who believed in the power of the human imagination, and he was a man who was not afraid to dream. He was a man who changed the world, and his story will continue to inspire generations to come. He was a man who taught us that the most powerful force in the world is not violence, but the creative spirit. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the obstacles we face, but the way we respond to them. He was a man who showed us that even in the darkest hour, hope is possible, and that the human spirit is indomitable. He was a man who once wrote, "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players." He was a man who saw the world as a stage, a man who saw human life as a drama, a man who saw the beauty and the tragedy of the human condition. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the success we achieve, but the difference we make in the world. He was a man who showed us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor, and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who was not just a playwright. He was a man who was a poet, a philosopher, a visionary, and a legend. He was a man whose story will continue to inspire generations to come. He was a man who taught us that the most important thing is not the obstacles we face, but the way we respond to them. He was a man who showed us that even in the darkest hour, hope is possible, and that the human spirit is indomitable. He was a man who changed the world, and he will never be forgotten. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the success we achieve, but the difference we make in the world. He was a man who showed us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor, and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who was not just a hero. He was a man who was a legend, a man whose story will continue to inspire generations to come. He was a man who taught us that the most important thing is not the obstacles we face, but the way we respond to them. He was a man who showed us that even in the darkest hour, hope is possible, and that the human spirit is indomitable. He was a man who changed the world, and he will never be forgotten.